right. And we are live. Cool. So Nick, thanks for joining. If you could just start maybe by briefly introducing yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Nick. I'm the founder at Inkeep. We do AI chat for developer docs. So basically, we help companies take their content, like their documentation, forums, support tickets, and anywhere where knowledge exists about the product, and turn that into both a search and chat experience that they can embed into their documentation or anywhere else they interact with their users.
Very cool. And I'm actually very curious because we haven't had a chance to talk about this yet, but what is the kind of founding story of Inkeep? What drove you to start a company?
So I worked on developer experiences at Microsoft for 3 years, and particularly for our identity products there. And so, if for most folks who've worked with identity, they know that like it's not necessarily like a developer's like joy in the sense of like it's not the thing that they want to be necessarily doing. Identity is the type of thing where you want to get out of the way and enable developers to kind of accomplish whatever scenario they had in mind and make sure they do it correctly and securely. But it's not something that you want the developer to be spending a ton of like cognitive power in. And it's also something that's like relatively complex and etc. And so what our goal was try to make that experience of adding authentication and authorization to your applications really easy and painless. And so I worked on developer experiences, and that entailed a lot of like self-serve onboarding experiences, how to make it so a developer doesn't have to read a bunch of documentation, but instead like things are intuitive, both from like an API level to an SDK level to also, there was a dashboard where you manage things, etc. So I worked a lot in like, how do we make all of these different touch points and interfaces for developers seamless and intuitive. And during that time, what I also saw though, was that we had like dedicated support teams all over the world. So folks who would just be, their dedicated full-time job was helping and supporting developers and our customers basically. And, Microsoft has a lot of resources, so they had a lot of these folks. But what I saw is that even at the scale of Microsoft with all these dedicated folks working on it, and they did a great job, but we also saw that a lot of things would still bubble up to like the product team or the engineering team that developers would ask for that like the support team wasn't able to help with. And we also did these basically like offsites where I would personally go. So I was a product manager. So I would personally go into one of these support centers for like a week or so just to get a sense of what things were like, kind of get, ear on the ground type of thing. And I would see that a lot of the questions that people were asking were things that were documented, or I knew the answer did exist, but it was just like spread out across all these different places, right? So we had like quick starts on GitHub, we had documentation, we had like a FAQ support center type of thing. So I knew that, a lot of the questions that I saw and what I would hear from the support folks was that they would get a lot of repetitive questions. So there were novel questions, that would need to be escalated to product and support teams or engineering teams. But there were also a good amount of questions that developers shouldn't really have to create a support ticket for. They should, in theory, be able to kind of find answers for themselves really quickly. And so seeing that and realizing that like technical support is really hard to scale, right? It requires a lot of nuance and detailed technical knowledge to be able to answer technical questions about a product. It requires like a developer or user, giving you logs and maybe sometimes even like snippets of their application code for you to be able to troubleshoot. So it just doesn't scale very well. And so that was really kind of the impetus behind Inkeep was, okay, how do we help companies be able to answer everything that is knowable about the product today automatically, instantly, for their users, for their developers using their product? That was kind of that's the gold kind of standard that we set for ourselves, is like, if it's knowable about your product, if it's been answered anywhere, then users shouldn't have to reach out to get help on it.
Got it. Yeah, I think that raises like a really interesting point. And I think one of the things that, put in the title slide for this chat and something that I've kind of been thinking about since I started using Inkeep, which is like there seems to be a fading distinction between the concept of search and the concept of support. And I am curious to hear your thoughts. Like, do you think that was always a false distinction that should have never have existed, and these categories were actually always one and the same? Or do you think it's just something that's changing now? Um, yeah.
That's a really good question. So when we were doing like our first, fundraising round like a year ago or a little more than a year ago, um, so we were doing Y Combinator, and one of the things that the partners or the mentors there tell you is like try to compare yourself to like an incumbent, right? So tell people because it gives VCs and other people like a reference mindset of like this is the target market, this is like this exists, people are paying for this type of thing, etc. And the comparison that I struggled with was like I was trying to orient myself around: are we competitors to Algolia, or like are we a comparable solution to Algolia, or are we competitors to Intercom? And like the more I struggled with that question, and the more like I A/B tested kind of those comparisons, the more I realized that like in my mind, I really do think those two things should be one company. Like I don't understand why they're two different things. Like there's no reason that you have to ask your question in the little chat bubble in the bottom right and not in the search bar where you're already looking for information. So I think in either of those interaction points, the user mindset or the user scenario is the same. Is I need an answer, or like I need to know how to do something, or I need an answer to like a question that I have about the product. Whether you're searching or you're trying to talk to a human or create a support ticket, any of these interactions, the root cause, if you will, is the same for a user. So in my mind, there shouldn't be a difference between those experiences. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. I think they are merging. I think LLMs make that bridge that gap even more from like a solution standpoint. So I think the problem was always the same. I'm a user. I need information about a product or an answer to a question. I just think the reason it was so forked is that the solutions weren't there, right? Like you needed a dedicated search platform and search service just to help folks navigate your content. But no one ever saw that as like a way or an interaction point for answering support questions. I think until now that it is possible to help answer support questions with like your content directly. Right. So yeah, we're on the journey to help merge those things for sure.
Yeah, and I guess you've already kind of hinted at this, but I guess to ask really explicitly, like how do you kind of position Inkeep as being different from some of the other solutions that are out there today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a few different things. So for example, comparing, so let's take it one by one. So let's do compared to Algolia. So for Algolia, they don't actually offer like an AI chat solution. So they're not really in that game. Maybe they will be at some point, but they haven't moved in that direction yet, at least. So they're just like a pure search solution. And what we find is that people are wanting to add this conversational experience to their search, right? So a decent amount of the inbound that we get or the interest that we get are folks looking for like a supercharged search. And so for those folks, like having LLM-based search, like a Perplexity-like experience or ChatGPT-like experience for your docs is like a really powerful concept and really useful for end users. So yeah, I'd say that's like compared to Algolia, that's number one thing is we offer the AI chat. And then additionally, with Algolia and traditionally when you're using any search service, whether Algolia or like self-hosting something like TypeSense or anything like that, you are kind of the burden is on you to keep the indices or the service up to date. So you're supposed to set up like the pipelines or the CI/CD to basically push the new content to these services, and also tell these services how to chunk and how to basically interpret your content, right? So you're supposed to tell it like, this is my H1, this is my H2, this is my H3, this is like the ordering of content, etc. For us, we've developed an algorithm that lets us take any given arbitrary website or documentation site and automatically do that for you. So we don't expect any of our customers to write any API code to keep their content up to date. So it's just, it's literally plug and play. You drop in your URL, we ingest that, and then we keep it up to date every 24 hours. You can set up like a GitHub action just to trigger a crawler, but we never expect you to think about like, how do I, inject, break up my content and push it or keep it up to date, etc. So I'd say from the search side of things, that those are the primary things. From the like support side of things, so like compared to like an Intercom or a Zendesk or any of those solutions, I'd say they're really centered around the traditional model of support, which is like the little chat bubble or like a support ticket somewhere. And that's how they expect users to interact with support. And so what we find from our experience is that, especially for developer products, that is not like the model that works for developers, right? So developers are actually they're a little bit evasive, or I don't know what the right word is, but they don't like necessarily the little intercom chat bubble or like the Zendesk chat bubble. And I think that's because in the past, even though it is a support solution, oftentimes intercom and services like it are used more as like a prospecting and sales tool, and developers don't like being marketed to or sales. And so they have like a negative connotation with the little chat bubble. They think of it as like someone trying to sell them, etc. So a decent, like, if we've actually done this where we like poll 100 developers or folks that we know who are engineers or work on developer products, and roughly around like 60% have like a negative connotation. 40% are like, oh, and I never thought of that as like an annoying thing. So like, not everyone has that, but I'd say a solid majority from our anecdotal experience find it frustrating. So for us, it's making it developer friendly. So making sure that it's transparent that you're talking to like an AI bot. And then the other part is meeting users where they are. So for example, if you use one of our search widgets, you can incorporate our chat as an actual search bot, right? So you get the search by default, and then you can toggle onto the chat by default. So like with Intercom, they don't have that type of experience where you can incorporate it as a search bar or as a Slack bot or a Discord bot. So we're, I'd say, more agnostic about, we don't make assumptions about where you think the best place to your users to interact with you are. We let you kind of integrate anywhere where your users interact with your product or your community as well.
Have you guys given any thought to, because I agree with you, like the best thing for me personally when I go into a site is if I can just find the information by searching in the search bar. And then if I can't, I think, asking an AI is a good next step. But then there's always going to be cases, like you said, where, the information doesn't exist because it's a novel question. Have you guys thought about the bridge from kind of search to AI chat, then onto, let's say, customer support? Like, how are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So even today, like in the last month or so, we've rolled out a few examples of how you can actually embed a support ticket form directly in our widget, and have that support ticket form basically call and create a support ticket in any support system. So if you use Zendesk or Help Scout, or some people use HubSpot or Intercom, whatever you're using, you can still use that as like your triaging center and like your way to track things internally. But you can use our widget to create the support ticket. And we also are writing a few examples of like how to toggle between our modal and like the live human chat modals, that type of thing. So we are actively thinking about, I guess, like, baseline is we don't want to force people to like switch over to anything, right? This should be plug and play. That's kind of the whole value proposition of our product. So we're first actively looking to see how we can make things easily plug and play with your existing support solutions. But in the like medium to long term, we are looking at how do we take over more of that end-to-end workflow, so that things are seamless end-to-end for our customers.
Makes sense. Cool. Yeah, and I think the things you said about what differentiates Inkeep definitely resonates with me. Like, that's exactly the experience that I've had. We were previously using Algolia before Inkeep, and getting Algolia set up was a pain in the ass. Took like a lot of false starts, a lot of like incorrectly compiled indexes, and back and forth until we got it right. And Inkeep, it was just as simple as pasting a URL into the portal. So I definitely noticed just how much easier it was to use your guys' tooling. And if anyone who's listening to this wants to see a live example of Inkeep, you can go to the Speakeasy docs or the Open API reference that we recently launched, and you guys can play with the tool. Because for us, Inkeep, I think, is it's a feature that actually differentiates our product. Like the Open API reference that we recently released, like one of the top pieces of feedback that we've been getting is how nice it is to have the AI search, just so that you can ask a specific question and just instantly get it. Because with Open API, it's such a like a large, it's a large amount of content. And rather than parsing through that, just being able to pull out the specific answer that you're looking for is a really powerful feature. Cool. And touching on differentiation, you did mention your API, and obviously you don't need to interact with the Inkeep API to get started using Inkeep. But I am curious, like, where does the API fit into the overall Inkeep product? How important is that surface area for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's kind of like two. I'd say our customers are like are what's the right word? They fall into two big buckets, right? So there's the ones, yeah, or bimodal distribution of our customers. Yeah, that's where I was like bimodal. So I'd say one, the one big one is the folks who, like you mentioned, just want to be able to drop in a URL, get really good search, get an AI chat service, and be able to drop that into their documentation with like a little bit of JavaScript. So that's one bucket of folks, and they, low touch, but also very high value for their end users. And then the other one is more folks who use us kind of like just like a RAG service, basically. And so there are folks who are like building very domain or product specific agents or co-pilots or whatever term you'd like to use. Those products or co-pilots, those assistants or co-pilots, they have different functionality. So for example, we have one customer who has like an experience where you can like call APIs basically, and they use us to like generate descriptions. Their agent generates descriptions for like API schemas and that type of thing. And they use our API to be able to. So they have all these functionalities that are specific to the product. We don't want to get into that game of like figuring out how to power those because they're very tailored for that particular product. But what they do is when they realize they need something from basically from their knowledge base, then they'll hit our API to be able to answer a user question. So an example there, some of it is automated in the sense of like, for example, if you run into an error when, I think you guys also do something very similar with the Speakeasy CLI, where if you run into an error, you can actually automatically call our API saying, hey, I'm a user, I'm trying to do XYZ command and I got this error. How do I resolve it? And so people can use it programmatically for those types of scenarios where it's not like necessarily domain product specific, but it's like it's in the format of a question and answer against your knowledge base. And so for those types of folks, giving them an API that they can work with, and not just an API and SDK, to make integrating us into those kind of larger agent type of experiences is really powerful. So that is kind of the other set of customers. Also, we have folks who like build their own total custom UIs for like the search and chat. So our out-of-box ones are pretty customizable, but folks always like to go crazy on them, and sometimes they decide to build their own UI as well. So that's kind of the other use case for the APIs is if you want like a total custom UX experience as well.
Is it fair to say that the API has kind of been a vehicle for experimentation and kind of like expanding, I don't know, the traditional chat interfaces or letting clients experiment using Inkeep's tool set?
Yeah, absolutely. Because like, so I'll use the Speakeasy CLI as an example. It's not really a chat experience. It's more like a auto troubleshooting experience where, like, if you run into an issue, it'll help you auto resolve it. So I think, there's another team that I know that they use our APIs from like their Slack experiences, and so basically they have their own very complex workflow around how they triage support tickets and support threads, and then also turn that into actionables for their documentation, etc. And they use our APIs kind of as part of that workflow. So I think it unlocks a lot of use cases that are outside of, like, I guess, like what people would traditionally think that would be possible with our service. So yeah, I think we sell to developer tools, and so even though like I don't know if I consider it. Yeah, I consider it ourselves a developer tool, but like the API is like the truest form of that, right? And so we want to empower people to kind of build whatever experiences they want on top of their knowledge is really the key goal.
And how important do you think having that API has been kind of on the sales side? Like, is that something that wins deals for you? Is it a nice to have? Like, yeah, how important does that factor in with people's buying decisions?
I think for the customers that really want the custom experience or that are looking for those custom agent or copilot experiences, we wouldn't have an answer to them otherwise. We would just like that we wouldn't be a viable like option for them. So for when it comes up, it's really important and can definitely be like the differentiating factor as to whether someone goes with us or not. So yeah, for those cases, it's super important. And also similarly, oftentimes people are really wary about the UX, or in the sense of like, they really want to be able to customize it and use their own fonts and all these different things. And so they'll ask us about if the API is an option, and being able to say that it is and show them that it's functional, that other folks use it, is a powerful tool. Even if in the end, a decent amount of them will end up using our widgets anyway, because they're customizable without having to interact with the API directly. But it is a powerful sales tool, and then folks do actually use it as well in terms of productizing and leveraging it for their scenarios.
Yeah. The way that I often think about it, I was actually describing it to someone the other day. I think it's nice when a product has kind of like a, in case of fire, like, the break glass option, so that if you want, you can always lift the hood, get into the guts, and kind of use the bits and pieces that you want. Even if you end up most of the time just using the things that are kind of prepackaged, it's nice to have that optionality to not feel as locked in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the architectural mindsets that I learned while working for the identity products from Microsoft was to always think about like, what is the most customizable, extensible version of whatever you're doing? And actually, oftentimes, it's better to start off there, because then you can design your data contract, oftentimes takes shape of an API, up front. And then, so I'll give you an example. So for like creating these support tickets and downstream services, we could go and build out-of-box integrations with every single support platform out there. Zendesk, Freshdesk, HelloFresh, all these support systems. But instead of, us creating those integrations requires a lot of development work and overhead from our side. So it was actually easier for us to unblock this scenario by first defining a data contract of, okay, if someone needs to escalate beyond the AI chat, how do we, one, let someone define a custom form that they want to collect information with? And what does the output look like in terms of the payload of the data? And then exposing that and letting people hook up their via API or via callbacks. In this case, it's like a JavaScript callback on the client side. So it's not really like an API, but by defining that and letting people plug into that they can make API calls and create support tickets in any support platform. And we don't have to manage kind of those data contracts with all these different support providers. And so we start there. And then in the future, we create the out-of-box experience for Zendesk and the other ones that I find really important. And so I've personally found that model to work really well, which is like create the most customizable, extensible version of whatever you're working on, so that people can accomplish any scenario that they want, and then make it look to raise the abstraction level with out-of-box integrations that build on top of that data contract that you defined in the first place. So that's a pattern that I love.
That's something that we're doing as well. Like, we recently released a feature that we're calling SDK hooks, but it's kind of exactly what you're describing. It's a extensibility feature. It lets people add custom code into the SDK generation process. And people are using it to do things like define custom authentication handling, add special logging. And we could do all these things, like you're saying. Like, we could go and build all these integrations and support all these different use cases. But to start, it's easier to just give people the flexibility in the platform to define some custom functionality. We can see what people do, observe what common use cases people find, and then we can focus on those ones that are really popular and build a polished experience for it. So I definitely agree with you. That's the way to go when you're developing software.
Exactly.
Cool. So right now, your guys' public API is, I believe, just one endpoint, right, with two methods. So on the smaller side, I'm curious what your thoughts are for how you see that expanding in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So we definitely want to expose our search functionality next. So right now, it's basically just the chat endpoints for creating a chat session and then continuing a chat session. for us next, we definitely want to expose the search APIs. I'd say that's the primary one. We have thought about also, since some folks do use this as kind of like RAG as a service, kind of like the intermediary between like a full chat completion and a search, which would be given this question and conversation history. Here is the relevant chunks or documents that might be helpful in answering your question.
I guess just for people that are not as plugged into the AI space, can you explain a little bit more RAG as a service? Like what does that exactly mean?
Yeah, for sure. So when you interact with any of these chatbots, you ask a question, and if they're if they're answering questions over a certain set of content that is not, that the model wasn't trained on. So for example, documentation, GitHub issues, that type of stuff. When you ask that question, how these AI applications are built is that basically, honestly, RAG just means search. So what happens is you take the user question, you take the conversation history for that, if they're already talking to the bot, and then you kind of figure out the big, I guess, complexity around it is like, how do you figure out what documents or what pieces of content are most likely to answer the user's question, right? And to do this, it's kind of search, but what you're really trying to land on is like pieces of content, not necessarily just entire documentation pages.
Right.
And that's because like the models have context windows, and even if they have really big context windows, it adds cost and complexity, and the quality actually goes down if you just jam the models with full 100 documents. That's just not practical. So what you really want is like the specific parts of documents across any set of documents. And by documents here, I mean any type of content that are most likely to answer the user's question. And then you pass that to the large language model, basically. And the large language model then basically has to reason about, given the user's question and the chat history and then the content that I'm given, what is the best answer that I can come up with. So at a high level, that is what RAG is, which is like taking content and being able to answer user questions with it, basically. And so the part that might be interesting is we already provide an API for the end-to-end flow, which is you give us a question and the conversation history, and we give you a chat response. So we have like optimized and worked with a lot of LLMs to figure out like what is the best configuration that basically lowers hallucinations, makes it so that the model only answers questions about your product, that type of thing. But some folks like to abstract that, or they want to do that on their own. They want to use their own models, open source, for whatever reason. They want to do that piece on their own. They want to do their own prompts and whatnot. So what might be interesting for them is to just give them the pieces of documents that might be best suited to answer the question. And then have them be able to call the LLM themselves instead of us doing it. So we might expose that as I don't know what the I don't know what the routes would look like on the API. But it is kind of like an intermediary between search, because raw search is about hitting the right documents, right? It's not about hitting about content within those documents necessarily. And so it's kind of like an interesting intermediary between the two. And also traditional search is usually like the input is a query, not a conversation history and a full question. So the input format's also a little different. So I think there's like an interesting in between search and full on chat that we might play with at some point.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay. So going back to the API and I guess turning to a topic that obviously I'm passionate about, you guys chose to build an SDK for your API very early on. Curious if you could explain your thought process around why you thought having an SDK was so important, even when your API was in a nascent state.
Yeah, I think I'm a TypeScript geek, and I started to write example scripts for different tasks that people wanted to do or different scenarios folks wanted to do. And I was just getting annoyed at not having type safety and having to like use a raw fetch and kind of have to think about what are the inputs and outputs here, etc. And so, I think that it was almost to like scratch my own itch, but I also knew that customers would appreciate it as well. So it just kind of made a lot of sense. And then I think the triggering point for me is I saw you guys came out with the streaming capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
for server-side events, basically, which is kind of the standard format for how a lot of these chat APIs, so from like OpenAI or Anthropic or all the different LLM models, they all use server-side events to basically stream a response as the LLM is generating it. And yeah, so I saw you guys come out with that, and I was like, oh, that's exactly what I was looking for. And so it just seemed like the right time that happened to align with when I was working on the API, creating these examples for a few customers I had for this.
Yeah.
So yeah, it just made sense, and it was super low friction too. So I was just like, I think I tried it locally. Like the SDK that it generated was like how I would have crafted myself, and I was like, I'm ready to share this with customers, basically.
Nice.
So it
That's what we
was,
like to
yeah,
hear.
yeah, exactly. So it wasn't like a huge barrier or anything like that. It was just kind of like a no-brainer. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely curious to hear kind of what has been the impact of having the SDKs, both externally but also internally. Because, like you were saying, one of the things you wanted to do is scratch your own itch, right? And maybe you can provide a bit more for those people who aren't familiar. Like, as a developer, how much easier is it to build when you have an SDK for an API versus just working with the raw, REST API?
I think, yeah, the biggest thing for me is it gives you the types for both the inputs and the outputs.
Mm,
And so you can do basically your IDE can now do IntelliSense on it, right?
yeah.
And so whenever you're typing things out, it just like autofills the right things for you, etc. Um, so I'd say for me personally, that's like the biggest thing. It's just like getting type safety both on the inputs, making sure that I'm like passing in only things that are supposed to be passed into the API, but also being able to get like autocomplete on as I'm writing it. So it just makes it like seamless instead of having to think about looking at the Open API spec and if I want type safety, like defining my own types for this stuff, etc. Um, so yeah, it just also gives me like a sense of security of like, hey, if I do TSC build to actually build my project and it checks out, then okay, that means everything type safety wise, everything's good. Versus if you're just dealing with our raw REST API, it's kind of like if you're using JavaScript instead of TypeScript in the sense of like you don't know if it works until
Yeah.
you run it, and then even if you run it and it works fine, there might be edge cases you didn't think about it. So for me that's kind of the largest proposition.
Very cool. Yeah. And then I guess from a customer or from a business perspective, like what do you think the value of having those SDKs is and will be down the road?
I think it's kind of like both from a sales perspective, like I was mentioning, and developers don't have to like to talk about sales, but I think um, it makes it obvious that we care about developer experience and that it makes it at least seem, but also because it's true, like it's very easy to use, right?
Yeah.
And so I think developers, when they use SDKs, they know those same benefits that I was mentioning. And so when they see that there is already like an out-of-box SDK for a given API, they're like, okay, cool. This is really well thought out. It'll be easy to use. Yeah, you guys actually came out with an integration with Minlify, who we use for our documentation, that
Yeah.
incorporates into our REST API documentation little code snippets on the side that show how to use the SDK. And so now when people are looking at our API reference page, they're also seeing the SDKs on the side. And so, yeah, it's great from both developer ease of use, so getting people integrated more quickly with our product, but also when developers or companies are evaluating our product, it also helps there. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah. That's what we like to hear. And then in terms of SDKs, there is one interesting wrinkle, I think, in the AI space, which is the Vercel SDK, which has kind of been acting as a conglomeration of all these different AI products. Can you talk a bit and explain to people who aren't in the AI space, like what is the Vercel AI SDK and kind of why has it been so popular?
Yeah, for sure. So the Vercel AI SDK, it kind of takes care of a few different things. So it takes care of being able to interact with different LLM providers with one data contract. So kind of like the stuff that LangChain would do, or there's other kind of providers that give you this kind of unified format. So it gives you that, but it does it in a way that's kind of, I think it feels more TypeScript, JavaScript native, if you will.
Mm,
I
yeah.
think the most of the wrappers or unified ways of interacting with LLMs that I know are like we're traditionally Python based SDKs set to start. And so I think that the TypeScript offerings tend to be less developed than the Python ones for those. But obviously Vercel and because they develop Next.js and a bunch of JavaScript frameworks. It feel like for example, the inputs are typed, the outputs are typed. You define things with Zod schemas.
Mm,
It just makes it, yeah, it feels very neat as in terms of developer experience. But it goes beyond just being able to talk to these different LLM providers, and you can basically use it to, if you're using Next.js, it makes it easy to create UIs that are using LLMs to generate. So not just chat UIs,
mm,
but recently, like in the last month or so, also being able to stream entire like components based on JSON outputs. So these LLMs, they can respond not just in like, answer format, like, pure text, but they can also respond in JSON.
mm,
And so what the AI SDK makes it easy to do is be able to use that JSON format to take that JSON, dynamically render components as the JSON is being streamed in, and then render that in the UI. So it lets you create interesting experiences that go beyond kind of just like chat-based stuff. So yeah, it's very neat. We've used it for a few different experiences, and one of the actual initial use cases for the Inkeep chat SDK was adding ourselves as a provider to
mm,
the Vercel AI SDK. So if you're using the Vercel AI SDK, you can use us to basically, it's like if you're using any other LLM provider, but then with the benefit that it's already plugged into your knowledge base. So you don't have to, think about indexing content or creating, vector stores or all these different things. You just get a chat endpoint that can answer not just any generic question, but questions specifically about your product as well, and then you can incorporate that into different chat experience, but also more complex experiences as you like. So yeah, that's kind of the rundown on the Vercel AI SDK.
yeah. I'm kind of curious. You mentioned Python. The Python ecosystem kind of, I would say, got a head start on a lot of this AI stuff, or that's where a lot of the tooling seems to have started off. But I'm curious, as a TypeScript guy, like, do you think that TypeScript will win out in the long run as kind of being the dominant language community for some of this AI stuff?
Oh man, I don't. I'm not in. I don't take hard positions like that, if you will. I think developer. So that I think the thing is a lot of traditional ML, CS, like data science folks, they're more familiar with Python, and the ecosystem around non LLM stuff is also rich in Python. So yeah, things basically in traditional data science are there. So I think there's a very strong ecosystem in Python. I don't think it'll go anywhere. Like I don't think it will
Yeah.
like diminish over time. I think what the Vercel AI SDK and the other tooling that's coming out around that's more TypeScript native, it's making it more accessible to app developers. So
Right.
folks who haven't traditionally been engaged with like data science ML type tasks. So I think it's just bringing more people into the fold, not necessarily convincing existing folks
Right.
who are super familiar with the Python ecosystem to switch over. So yeah, I think that's what's great is it makes it more accessible. I think the future of app development is incorporating more of these generative experiences, not just chat, but things that can stream in and pull content and context from many different systems to like augment UIs in dynamic ways. The TypeScript ecosystem makes it so that traditional full stack app developers or front end developers, etc., can kind of tap into that and start creating really cool experiences. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm excited about there.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. It's a diplomatic and thoughtful answer, and I think you're right. Like, I think the getting tooling that helps TypeScript developers, I think, is gonna be what I guess creates the conditions for like an explosion in creativity and people building new stuff, which is very exciting.
Yeah, I think.
Cool.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think, yeah, that the big breakthrough with LLM is aside from just like the power that they have, the general knowledge that they can compress and be able to generate outputs based on, has been, in my opinion, that it makes creating these smart, intelligent experiences, so AI experiences, much more approachable to anyone because the models are just so powerful and can abstract away so much from you. So, for example, in the past, if you wanted to generate a report that like tries to, so for example, we have these reports that give you an idea of or a breakdown of basically the major topic areas where there are gaps in your documentation. So areas where people have asked questions and the bot wasn't able to find content for. In the past, to like
Incidentally,
create.
that report is great for creating blog post ideas. So thank you. Sorry, continue.
Absolutely, yeah. So in the past, you couldn't really generate something like that unless you were like a deep ML expert, where you had to think about like embeddings and how to do clusterings together, etc. With LLMs, we do some of that to optimize the experience, but you can, as a first pass, just like throw a bunch of questions into the LLM and have it categorize it for you. So things like that, I think it's unlocking a whole new set of scenarios for non like traditional ML folks to be able to engage with and build entire applications and companies with. So it's very cool.
Yeah, very cool. And on the topic of kind of building new things, I am curious what's coming up next for Inkeep. What are you personally very excited by that you guys are working on?
I know there's so many things
that you can share.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in the immediate sense, actually this week we're launching an option where, so before, if you dropped in a URL, we would still basically like personally validate anything that came through and set up a demo for you and share like a link with the person that reached out. But that iteration still took like a few hours, if not a day, to get back to you. And the reason we did that was just we wanted to make sure that every customer that we onboarded was really high quality, and we just felt that even though we have these AI smart algorithms to like figure all this stuff out, and we feel pretty good about them, we still wanted to kind of do the human validation there, just to get make sure that it wasn't 90% accurate, but it was like 100% accurate. But I think we've gone far enough in that journey to developing all these algorithms and systems to feel really highly confident that we can just fully automate it at this point. And so this week we're launching a self-serve option where you can come in, drop in your URL, we'll run our scrapers, and we'll generate a chat experience that's already pre-configured specifically for your company, like with your logo, with example questions, etc., all under like 30 minutes and fully automated. So if you're curious just to see like what our solution can do based on your content, you can just come in and drop by URL and get a sandbox. You don't have to talk to me if you don't want to, but if you do, happy to as well. Yeah, so I think that's the first exciting thing that's top of mind. I think there's tons of things that we're working on that goes back more towards like the support workflows that we were talking about, like how to make those handoffs more seamless. So that's kind of the broader scope in the long term. Yeah, this week that's what I'm talking about.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, it's good. You guys are living by your credo. Make it as easy as possible for people to self-serve and not have to talk to anyone.
Exactly. Yeah, it's always been a little bit of a contradiction of our product up until this point, which is like, the whole point is you don't have to talk to the initial point was you can get answers about content without talking to a human if you don't want to, but just get set up. You still need to talk to me, but now you don't.
I get it. We're an API tooling company, but we haven't yet exposed our public API. So I think contradictions are, inherent when you're getting started. But as long as you get there in the end, right?
Yep.
Cool. All right, cool. Anything else that you kind of want to say? I think that this has been pretty wide ranging. We've covered a lot of topics.
No, I think, just personal shout out to Speakeasy. Definitely made our SDK experience super seamless. And like I said, for me, it was a no-brainer once I tried it and saw that it worked great. So yeah, excited to keep on kind of generating more SDKs for different languages, etc.
Yeah, and I'll send the shout out right back at you. Like using Inkeep has been an absolute delight. Like our search experience went from, I would say, barely passable to, I think, best in class, and it only took a couple of hours. And being able to launch things like the OpenAPI reference with AI powered search has been like a complete game changer. It really is like a killer feature that pulls people to using the tooling that we have. So, and very excited for the CLI launch. So for those, we kind of talked about this earlier, but I guess to cover it really explicitly, we're going to be integrating Inkeep into our CLI so that when you have errors, you can get suggested responses back from an AI that suggests solutions to your problems. You'll also be able to directly ask questions from the CLI without having to navigate to our doc site. So we're very excited about that. We want people to be able to find answers wherever their work is happening. So thank you for making that possible and easy for us to do.
For sure.
All
I
right.
think it's a
Cool.
neat combination of your guys' SDKs and our service.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, looking forward to much continued and shared success. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
For sure. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
All right. See you later, Nick.
Bye-bye.